Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to our fifth podcast session. In this session, we will review chapter 6. We will have a brief summary of chapter 7. We will shed light on the historical events Machiavelli presents in chapter 7. And finally, we will discuss ideas learned and attempt to analyze them from an Islamic perspective. So firstly, we will have Sister Haneen, who will be giving us an overview of chapter 6, and she will also be summarizing chapter 7 for us.
In this chapter, Machiavelli addresses the aspect of gaining principalities, and in particular, how a prince would gain a principality using his own powers, his own abilities, and his own armies. And he starts the chapter with saying that such prince should aim to use or follow the steps of the great, let's say, previous examples, and through this he can basically achieve his endeavors. In this chapter, Machiavelli also addresses that the prince would have two types of supporters, independent supporters and lukewarm supporters, and how can lukewarm supporters be really detrimental for the prince to achieve his endeavors. And also in certain circumstances, the prince needs to use force in order to bring people under control or bring them into order. So that is a brief summary of chapter 6. Moving on to chapter 7, Machiavelli continues on how a prince should gain a principality, but here the concept is different, as Machiavelli moves into different circumstances where the prince would use or acquire a principality by fortune or relying on others. And in this circumstance, he gives us a different examples, and he says, like, such princes, when they rise to, let's say, authority or position, they wouldn't face any problems or difficulties to gain it in the first place, but to maintain it, they will have to sort of face many troubles, and they need to have ability and knowledge in order to keep what the fortune has thrown into them into position. He mentions that knowledge and power, as well as the ability, is crucial and important to maintain the prince's authority. And if a prince rises to power suddenly, he won't be able to maintain it, and in order to minimize the troubles that he faces, he will sort of need wisdom, needs virtue, and he needs to act immediately in order to be able to keep everything under control. And if a new prince rises to power without any foundation, he can sort of lay this foundation with virtue, as long as he does that through wisdom, through good tactics. Otherwise, it will be difficult. And he gives the metaphor: if a prince gains power without foundation, it will be difficult, just like creating troubles to architect or creating dangers to the building. So that was a very brief summary of chapter 7. Now I'll pass it on to Zain.
Beginning the history for chapter 7. So Machiavelli first very briefly refers to Darius I and kind of subsequently the Ionian Revolt, I believe it's pronounced. So first, for a little bit of background on who Darius the First is. Darius the First was the emperor of the Persian Empire from 522 to 486 BCE, and he's kind of very well known for kind of leading one of the more prosperous and, I guess, forward-moving moments of the Persian Empire, and was able to take over kind of major parts of Europe, Greece, and eventually the Indus Valley, and kind of greatly expanded the empire and its influence. Now, for his relevance in this chapter and how Machiavelli refers to him, so following Ionia's initial conquering in 500 BCE, the Ionians led a revolt against the Persian Empire and kind of their taking of its territory. And that revolt began in 499 BCE. Now, I think the main relationship which should sort of be focused on in this chapter is that between Darius I and another individual called Histiaeus, I believe. And Histiaeus was kind of pronounced the leader of Ionia following its initial capturing. So that means he is, a prince who acquired a territory sort of like by luck or good fortune, as it's kind of referred to in this chapter. But then in an attempt to kind of maintain that power, because he felt at risk of kind of losing his power to Darius, who he was kind of answering to, he joined the revolt, and he was kind of well known for being an instigator of that revolt. And the revolt finally ended in 493 BCE, because the kind of Persians were such a mighty empire at the time, they were able to quite quickly quash the rebellion. But yeah, I think the main thing to sort of take out from this conflict, Darius I and Histiaeus, is that kind of the desperate measures taken by the desperate and sometimes inexperienced decisions made by kind of kings or princes who acquire their land by kind of good fortune or luck, showing how Histiaeus kind of quickly turned against Darius to try to secure his control. I will now hand it over to Mustafa.
Francisco Sforza was an example of a prince who did not only rely on fortune, but also relied on his abilities to eventually become the Duke of Milan. And as mentioned by Machiavelli in chapter 7, Francisco acquired Milan with 1,000 anxieties, but he kept it with little trouble. So just a bit of history about Milan. So the Visconti family became lords of Milan in 1277 and had their title changed to Duke in 1395 after paying 100,000 gold florins, which is roughly 17 million Australian dollars in today's money, to the king of the Roman Empire. The last Duke of Visconti died without an inheritor in 1447, after which the Golden Ambrosian Republic existed for only 3 years. After 3 years of riots and rage in the streets of Milan, Francisco Sforza, who had married the daughter of the last Duke of Visconti, was entrusted with the Duchy of Milan by the city's Senate in 1450. Now, this was the first time that such a title was handed over by a lay institution. While the other Italian states gradually recognized Sforza as a legitimate Duke of Milan, he was never able to obtain official recognition from the Roman Emperor. However, that did change in 1494 after the Roman Emperor of the time formally recognized Francisco's son, Ludovico, as the Duke of Milan. Francisco was able to cope and face these struggles by winning the hearts of the people in Milan through his hard work. He modernized the city, he created an efficient system of taxation and generated enormous revenues for the government, and his court became a center of the Renaissance learning and culture. Francisco was also the first European ruler to follow a foreign policy based on the concept of the balance of power, and the first native Italian ruler to conduct extensive diplomacy outside the peninsula to counter the power of threatening states such as France. Francisco managed to form good relationships with rulers of other states such as Cosimo de' Medici, who was the ruler of Florence at the time. And through that friendship, he managed to contribute to the formation of the Italian League, which was a defensive alliance of Italian states that succeeded in establishing almost all of Italy for its duration. Francisco Sforza died in 1466, and he was succeeded by his son, Lodovico. And yeah, that was the summary about Francisco Sforza. And now I'll hand it over to Sister Mariam, who will talk about the family of Borgia.
Inshallah. In this chapter, Machiavelli focuses a lot on one particular character called Cesare Borgia. And one of the reasons why he has such a large focus on him is because he pretty much was with him for 16 years. So he knows everything about him, ins and outs. He was one of his political advisors. And he uses him as an example of someone who gained his power or ability because it was handed over to him by his dad. But then he says that he was good in the sense that he then expanded on that power he was given and made it so that it was through his own ability that it could sustain itself. But he then says that it wasn't a complete success because once his father died, Cesare's empire all crumbled with it. But to understand how his father got into power, we need to start with who the Borgias actually are. So they're a Spanish Aragonese family, not Italian, and it is unknown to what their origin actually is. They promote the idea that they are part of the lineage of the Kingdom of Aragon from Pedro de Atares, who died childless. So it's kind of impossible, but this is kind of what they promote so that they give themselves this official status. Their enemies, on the other hand, kind of speculate or promote that they were Moranos, which is kind of the Spanish word for saying the Jews in Spain. And what happened during the Inquisition, all Muslims and Jews were either forced to convert to Christianity or kicked out. And it's said that the Borgias were one of those who converted, allegedly, but there's no confirmation for that. The person who kind of brought the fame to the Borgia household was a guy named Alfonso de Borgia. And he studied civil and canon law at the University of Granada, and he eventually became a professor. And because of his extensive studies, he then became the diplomat for the King of Aragon, Alfonso V, and he helped unite or kind of make amends between the Spanish Empire and the Church. And because of his ability to amend this relationship, he was given a position in the College of Cardinals. And he also was made the Bishop of Valencia. So it kind of gives you an idea that at this time, the church really didn't have kind of a religious role, but more of a political role in the structure of society at the time. And he eventually became Pope, and his Pope name is Calixtus III. And he was kind of accused of nepotism because he then pushed for his two nephews to be put into the College of Cardinals, one of which is Rodrigo Borgia, and the second nephew is Louis Julian de Milla. And so he was kind of a revered pope, unlike other popes such as Rodrigo Borgia, because he was said to forward the Catholic image and try to maintain it. So some things that he did, which people kind of commend him for, is he promoted the Crusades against the Ottoman Empire 2 years after the fall of Constantinople. He kind of pushed for the retrial of Joan of Arc and got her executed to kind of maintain the image of the man, the one who receives kind of gifts or revelations from God. And then the other thing that he did was he reintroduced slavery in the Canary Islands, which is off the west coast of Africa, also to maintain, say, the image of the white Christian rather than anything else. 2 years after he was elected Pope, he increased the status of Rodrigo Borgia in the College of Cardinals, and he was made the Vice Chancellor of the Church. And even after his uncle died, Rodrigo continued to serve in his position with 4 different popes until he was able to buy his way to the papacy, and he became Pope Alexander V, which is mentioned a lot in The Prince. And he didn't really care about his position as a holy person, because he was very open about a lot of the sins that he had committed. Some include adultery, incest, simony, theft, bribery, lasciviousness, nepotism, and murder, with lasciviousness and nepotism being directly related to Rodrigo himself. And examples of this is that he was quite the womanizer, not only through looks, but through his intellect and the way, and his smooth talking pretty much. And in terms of nepotism, he, out of the 23 cardinals, he managed to get 10 of them to be part of his family. So 10 Borgias were in the cardinals. And then he added 47 new cardinals into the college, made up of his allies. He had many children, of course, but the 4 that were soon legitimized were Juan or Giovanni Borgia, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Jafore. And all 4 of them were used by Rodrigo for his own political or power gain. So Giovanni was married to the cousin of Ferdinand of Spain to kind of cement their alliance with Spain, and he was also made the head of the papal army. Cesare got jealous of his brother for being the head of the papal army, as some say, and Giovanni died in really mysterious circumstances, and as soon as he died, Cesare was made head of the papal army. Moving on to Cesare, who the chapter is all about, he was kind of forced by his father into education in law, politics, science, and theology up to the age of 14, and then he was made a cardinal. And there's a lot of people who say that he wasn't a religious person. He was quite the womanizer, and he preferred the sciences and arts over theology. And so this may have been one of the intentions why he could have, or he's a primary suspect in the murder of his brother. He was then married to the next in line of the throne of France, Charlotte d'Albert, and he was given by the King of France the name Duke Valentino, which is he's very commonly known by, which means the Duke of Power. After he became the head of the papal armies, he kind of decided to expand his empire even further. Rodrigo's 3rd child is Lucrezia Borgia. A lot of people say that she was a victim of her family, given that not only she was the daughter of Rodrigo, but she was his illegitimate wife and daughter-in-law. She was married for political gains. The first marriage she was sent to was Giovanni Sforza, who was the son of the Duke of Milan at the time. But once the relationships between the church and Milan kind of drained and drifted away, they decided to annul the marriage on the basis that it was never consummated. And she was married to Alfonso of Aragon. So this is also in Spain. And the thing is, she actually fell in love with her husband and they had a nice relationship. Cesare got jealous of him because Lucrezia was only his, and he ended up murdering Alfonso of Aragon. And so finally, she was married to Alfonso the First d'Este, who was the Duke of Ferrara, and she kind of lived the rest of her life there. What she's mostly common for is poisoning people, and the whole trope of the poisonous women came from Lucrezia Borgia. And then the final child is Jafore, who was married to the granddaughter of the King of Naples. He was 12 years old and she was 16. But the important 3 characters in the Borgia family are Rodrigo, Lucrezia, and Cesare Borgia. And so what Rodrigo ended up doing was he tried to push also the narrative of the white Christian. And he did it in 2 ways. The first thing is by giving authority to the Spanish to expand into the New World and to enslave the native people, and to give Portugal the right to expand towards the east, which was all of Africa, and also to gain slaves from them. And no other empire was given the right by the church to expand, but that didn't really stop them either. And the second thing that he did was he recreated the image of Christ. So originally Christ was not Caucasian. He made this competition between Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, telling them that they had to re-image Christ. And Leonardo da Vinci ended up winning this contest because he used Cesare Borgia as his image. And so the modern Jesus is actually Cesare Borgia, which is nice to know. Now the important thing that Machiavelli mostly talks about in this chapter is Cesare, his conquests, and what he kind of did. So as soon as he gained his army by the Pope, he decided to help the French in their conquering of Milan. And then what he decided to do is he wanted to expand the kind of the papal state. So what he did initially was go to Flori and take it, and also to Imola. These were two cities which were controlled by Caterina Sforza. So he thought that it was easy to kind of take them from a woman, I guess. After that, he went towards Fiesza, and he managed to get it as well. But then he wanted to go to Bologna, and he was unable to capture it because his troops, the Orsini, weren't enthusiastic, as Machiavelli says. And so they ended up doing a treaty instead, which Cesare considers as a failure, pretty much. And then after that, he ends up going to Rimini and Piastro. He gets them all. And these 5 states become the new Romana. And this is when he decides to put Messer Ramiro di Lorca as kind of the head of the state. And he was a tyrant, and he kind of did that so that he would unite everybody and stop all the bickering between these minor cities. As soon as the purpose was achieved, Cesare goes in and he executes Ramiro on the terms of he was being unjust to the people. And he did that to kind of maintain his image as the good guy rather than the bad guy who brought this tyrant in. After his conquest at Pesaro, he goes to Urbino and Camerino, and he kind of gains these two with no fight whatsoever. They kind of just give themselves up to him out of fear. After that, he tries to go into Tuscany, but the French stop him or discourage him from doing so. And so he also starts to distrust the French army. And then he decides to continue. And this is when the Perugia kind of alliance occurs, which was meant to kind of push Cesare out of the power that he has. And this is when he went from offense to a defense strategy. But through the kind of money that he was getting from the church, he was able to kind of crush this small rebellion. And so the people who were involved in this rebellion attempted to become allies with him. But after he used them, he kind of got rid of them because he knew he couldn't trust them fully. And then after that, he goes into Senegalia, Paraguay, takes it, Piombo, and then he also goes or becomes the primary support for Pisa. So he ends up going into the Republic of Florence, but he never manages to take it. And the reason for that is his father dies at the age of 72, and he contracts syphilis, which was brought into Naples by the French. And because of that, he was unable to buy kind of a large portion of the cardinals to his side. So he had to kind of go for or elect a pope which would not kind of destroy his empire. So he helps the election of Pius III. But Pius III only stays for 2 months and then he dies. Pope Julius II comes to Cesare and he makes like an agreement with him, telling him that I'll let you keep your territory as long as you make me pope. Cesare, for some reason, believes him, and Julius ends up being the biggest enemy of the Borgia, and he completely destroys Cesare's empire and causes him to get imprisoned. He gets exiled to Spain and imprisoned in the castle for 2 years, but then he later escapes and goes to France to help his brother-in-law. And he kind of just fights for the French until he dies. So that is the story of Cesare Borgia. The criteria that kind of Machiavelli gives, which suggests that Cesare was successful until he kind of gave himself up to Julius II, was that he ensured he was safeguarded against his enemies, that he won friends, that he would conquer, whether that be through force or fraud, that he made sure he was loved and feared by the people, but obeyed and respected by his soldiers. He eliminated anybody who may cause him harm, may cause him harm, and he modernized all the old traditions to keep people on his side from all kind of types, I would say. He was severe, but also well-liked. He was monogamous and generous at the same time. Removed his disloyal armies and made his own so that they would support him all the way. And he maintained his alliances, not by being friendly, but to make sure that they're either glad to help him or too afraid or to offend him. So those are the 11 points that Machiavelli says were good on Cesare's behalf. But with all given states, they are unstable, and so is Cesare's.
Indeed.
I guess so, because it's not like that Cesare kind of fit all of those criteria. Like he did in Machiavelli's eyes, but because Machiavelli, I guess, admired him so much and kind of overlooked all of his problems, he made those criteria kind of based not only on him, but predominantly on Cesare. And then through kind of him making it seem like, oh, he has the good and the bad, removes the strong armies, bad armies, he pretty, I think, effectively presents, at least maybe to someone who isn't very good at analyzing maybe the history behind it and all that, kind of presents how this might be a good way of leading a nation or something like that. Kind of very over glorifies them.
I feel like in this case, one really does need to look into the context of the history before making a judgment on, say, the methods Cesare Borgia used. Cesare at the time was not considered as a dictator or a tyrant because of the circumstance of the time. What Cesare did for his time was pretty standard. He was very politically smart in how he went about things. But if you're comparing him to the other tyrants at the time, he wasn't as tyrannical. But he wasn't a peacemaker either. He just wanted power. He's quite narcissistic in a way that he believed he was able to do anything. He believed he was beyond the law, beyond human mortality almost.
Yes. Yeah, and exactly. Even Machiavelli states that. He says, Machiavelli says, he told me himself that he planned everything, but the one thing that he didn't plan, he did not think that
he would get sick.
He would get sick.
So Machiavelli was simply giving strategies that work, strategies which were permissible at the time. In our modern day context, these would be considered completely immoral and dangerous to promote. And I feel like people who do read the Prince without understanding the time would, fall into the trap of being tyrants and dictators. But if you read it within the context, one understands that you have to use the tactics or the measures that are being used by other political leaders at the time in a strategic way that would gain you favor. But the 13 things that he mentions, I think, are important to use in any case scenario. He's going to go through all of these in detail, but I do think that these are kind of the main points that people can apply and remove it from the context of the story, because that story was given to somebody who understood the politics at the time by someone who understood the politics at the time or the methods behind the madness. But at the same time, I'm not here to justify what Cesare did either.
Yeah. I think an interesting point that I really liked in Machiavelli that has raised that he said, when he said fortune and goodwill are two things that are really unreliable and unrealistic to rely on, if you like. So when I thought about it, like from an Islamic point of view, if you like, being a Muslim, like we cannot rely on the goodwill or support of others. We always rely on Allah. But at the same time, we, in addition to tawakkul, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet teaches us how like to have tawakkul, but we also do our part. Like the Prophet says, aqil wa tawakkal. So like tie your camel and and then rely on Allah. You cannot just, leave your matters, leave your affairs unorganized or without having a thought into it, without having a plan, and just say that, I can trust in Allah. So that, one thing. And in terms of fortune, we always learn that we need to be optimistic. So, and we gain our fortune through being optimistic. And that's how like we have the hadith that says, "Tafa'alu bil khair tajidu." So be optimistic and then you will face fortune. You will end up being fortunate. So these two things sort of help us that, trust in Allah and tawakkul on Allah is something important, but again, you need to do your part. And tafa'ul is important because that will lead you to positive conclusions, so to speak. But again, knowledge, power, experience offers, as Machiavelli explains it, being the ability, developing your ability through striving, through working hard, doing your part, gaining experience and knowledge in whatever field that you're going through. That sort of will give you in a better position and help you to sustain, for example, a position or an authority in whatever field you are, so to speak. And also another thing that I found somehow interesting when he says knowledge and power / ability is crucial in maintaining, position or maintaining, for example, power. When he gives the example of laying foundations, how it's important to ensure that foundation is laid down prior to gaining power or prior to having that fortune throwing, itself on you, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, and it, that can be sort of looked at on mustawa al-fard, like on an individual level, so to speak. So like us, what we can learn from this is that even if we are not in positions, even if we are not having any status or any role, we should continuously aim to educate ourselves in whatever field we can as practical as possible, because that will give us and put us in advancements. And especially at the times of fitna or at the times of tribulation, you're equipped with knowledge, you're equipped with experience, and even attempt to be in a situation where you can learn and sort of be prepared onto what if, for example, face if in circumstances where you would find yourself in troubles, how would you react to these sort of things? And also, this is a little bit off track, but although officially we might not have positions, but we know deep inside we all have a role to play, being inshallah on the way, or having a role to play in the government of Imam Mahdi Ajallah Farajah. So if we look at it from this perspective, we should always aim to educate and learn in all different fields and as much as it's practical for us. So we are prepared when fortune throws itself on us. We are prepared before, so we are laying this foundation prior to gaining power, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And also, the more I read the Prince, the more I strongly believe that we absolutely need a divine assigned ruler to be on earth. Because if we speak objectively and take ethics and religion out of the picture, do you think it would have been possible for people like Saddam and Borgia to reach where they reached in life without being ruthless and without, being thirsty for blood and whatnot?
Would you say that? Because Machiavelli, he's not a particularly religious individual, really. So, it wouldn't really kind of condemn that in any sort of way. And I don't know, I feel like Machiavelli, he's very utilitarian, and I don't like that about him. He's kind of like, you know what? If it gets the job done, then it's all good.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think he is quite a religious person, personally.
Yeah.
Just because of the last chapter, what he says about Musa alayhi salam.
Okay, yeah.
And his future opinion when he talks about fate as well. think he does have religious elements, but I also think that what he was attempting to do was separate religion and politics, because at the time they were so ingrained with one another, given that the Borgias were, in charge and everything.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know.
Yeah. I think
I think
maybe saying like it wasn't a religious person was like, that's a bit maybe too personal, but like, yeah, kind of like that distinction between what's permissible maybe on like more of a personal level and then on a political level, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, because there are in a few chapters when he talks, he specifically mentions that this is not ethically moral and I do not support this, but here I go anyway. I mean, I think more than anything, he's an example of how privilege cannot get you to the top. You need your own ability and your own skill to add to that to kind of propel you forward in whatever path you pick. And
Absolutely.
I feel like that's kind of what we should apply in our current day and age.
Absolutely, because ultimately what Machiavelli is trying to say, what comes easy is lost easily. So this is very true, not just in terms of politics, but in any field of life, in any field of like, so whether it's on individual level or like a, government or any level in life or any field, whatever, without perseverance, without experience, without continuous knowledge or, maintaining or, having this ongoing search for knowledge and for information to make sure you find the best to practice, so to speak. Otherwise, that status or that position cannot be maintained.
Thank you for joining us for our 5th session of The Prince, where we talk about Chapter 7, how to gain a principality through fortune. There's going to be a part 2 where we talk about wickedness and how you could gain a principality using that. So inshallah, stay tuned for the next video.